Veterans Chronicles is sponsored by the state of Qatar, representing Qatar's commitment to the U.S.
Hi, I'm Greg Corombos. Our guest this week on Veterans Chronicles is U.S. Army veteran Luis Alvarez. He is a West Point graduate and has a PhD from MIT. While serving in Iraq, Luis came to the conclusion that too many of his fellow soldiers ended up having amputations following traumatic injuries. He believed there had to be a better way to regenerate bone and soft tissue. And so he embarked, with the military's blessing, on an effort to make that vision a reality. Luis is the founder of Theradaptive, a regenerative therapeutics company. He joins us today to discuss his time in the service and his ongoing work to help those wounded in service to our country. And Luis, thank you very much for being with us.
Greg, it's great to be here. Thanks so much.
Let's start at the beginning of your story. Where were you born and raised?
So born and raised in Miami, Florida. And never really left Florida that often until I decided to join the Army. So I'm a Florida boy through and through.
Is there a military service history in your family?
Yes. Both my grandfathers fought on opposite sides of the Spanish Civil War. Lucky for me, neither of them was a good shot. My father and uncle both served, my uncle here in the U.S. and my father in the Spanish Army. And I just felt a calling to serve as well for my country. So it was that kind of drew me to serve when I was very young.
What was the reason you wanted to attend West Point, and when did that start, that interest in attending West Point?
Well, I really didn't know very much about the service academies. Somebody brought to my attention that you could go to a military school but also study engineering, and that would give you a path to later on choose, of course, either a career of military service or go on to do other things. In that case, I wanted to do science. So it was very interesting to me and different than the other universities I had applied to. So I decided to go for both Naval Academy and West Point, and I don't like the water that much, so I went to West Point.
How did those years at West Point change you as a person and as a soldier?
I think they were formative years for me. Of course, everyone who goes there is quite young, and for me, it was a refreshing experience in a way. You don't hear that often. Of course, the first couple of months are, kind of a culture shock, but after that, you really can thrive, right? For me, it was an experience to learn not just academics, but also how to lead people. And it was a kind of laboratory where you can test different leadership styles. And it was just a lot of fun for me, and I have good memories of having been there.
What year were you commissioned?
1997.
1997. And where did they send you upon commissioning?
Right after West Point. In my last year, I had applied to what's called the Hertz Foundation Fellowship. And the Army at the time only really had a small handful of fellowships that they would allow you to use to go to graduate school. Back then it was the Rhodes, the Truman, the Marshall, and the Hertz. So the Hertz is a technical fellowship that lets you get your PhD. And so our first assignment out of the Army was actually to MIT to do a master's degree. And then after MIT, I called the Army branch management. I said, what would be a good assignment for me? And they said, the greatest opportunities for you would be in South Korea. So I believed him and accepted that assignment.
Was he right?
He was right, actually. I thought, well, this is not... normally Korea back then was the last assignment you'd want to go to besides maybe Alaska or Alabama. But I ended up going to the 2nd Infantry Division. And then when I got there, they said, actually, you're being reassigned from your original unit to 47 Cav, which is a division cavalry squadron, much closer to the DMZ. And I got to tell you, it was probably one of my favorite assignments looking back. It was really a great experience.
And where did you go after that?
So after that, came back to the U.S., did the Military Intelligence Advanced course, the Counter Intel course, and then went to Fort Hood. And it was right as I was finishing the Counter Intel course, 9/11 happened. So essentially everything from there forward, it just completely changed. So I went to Fort Hood to the 1st Cav Division and was the division targeting officer, and then served as a brigade S2 for the 5th Brigade Combat Team. We deployed to Iraq from there. So that assignment was kind of the Super Bowl of MI for me. It was really a great experience.
When were you in Iraq?
I was in Iraq from 04 to 05. And then when we came back, our unit was decommissioned. We were a brigade combat team that was assembled ad hoc. We were a tank battalion, an infantry battalion, and an MLR, multiple launch rocket battalion that had been converted into infantry. So we were this type of junkyard dog of sorts unit, but we really had unique cohesion in that way, and it was really a great unit to serve in.
I don't know if there is such a thing as a typical day in Iraq, but what were your general responsibilities and duties there?
So I was the S2, which is the intelligence officer for the 5th Brigade combat team. And the 5th Brigade had responsibility for essentially the southern half of Baghdad. Everything from what you might hear called Highway 8 and the airport, and then the river, on down to what they call the Fias. Latifia, Muhammadiyah, and Yusufia. And my responsibilities were to coordinate all the intelligence operations, collection, dissemination, interrogations, and human intelligence in the southern half of Baghdad.
At what point did you start to notice the wounds of your fellow soldiers and think that a lot of these traumatic wounds, too many of them are ending up as amputations? When did that idea first start coming to your mind?
Well, actually, that was a kind of delayed effect because many people were becoming injured and being medevaced out, including, on a patrol that I was on, our Humvee was hit with an IED and our gunner was severely wounded. What I saw there was that many limbs were mangled, but when you get to the green zone, to the hospital, they're able to stabilize people and do some really, I consider miraculous work to save limbs. But then when I got back to the States, I would hear accounts of some of these same people and other people who had amputation weeks or months after the original injury. And I found that really troubling because I thought, well, military medicine has really done a lot to save people's lives and salvage a limb. But what ended up happening is that normally those limbs would have either bone or nerve or vessels that didn't heal properly. And so that limb actually became more of a burden than a useful appendage. So they would undergo amputation. And I thought, we really need to focus on the sub-problem here, which is how do you regenerate tissues so that people can, not only salvage a limb, but actually make it useful again. So that was the kind of the realization that brought the idea together.
I know you're not a doctor, but and you talked about this a little bit, but what generally goes into the decision that doctors make that the amputation needs to happen?
Well, number one, the question is the limb useful to you, right? So if you have a limb that you've salvaged, the limb is alive, but let's say you're not able to heal the bone, so you have a persistent break, then you actually can't use that limb. You have to use a wheelchair or use crutches your whole life. I mean, that's more of a disability. Whereas if you amputate let's say a lower extremity like a leg, and you get fitted with a good prosthetic, the outcomes there are actually superior to having your original limb. So the decision is, do you want to have a higher quality of life with this prosthetic, or do you want to keep your original limb and always have a disability that's greater than you would if you had a prosthetic? So it's a very hard calculation. Imagine somebody telling you, basically, do you want to give up your leg to lead a better life? I mean, I would never want to be faced with that decision.
So as you were thinking about this, was it a matter of seeing that prosthetics to some level were doing better than the actual limbs, and you kind of extrapolated that to bone and soft tissue in general? Or was it part of your academic training before that kind of fed into your analysis of that?
Well, I had some prior experience at MIT through the master's degree in bioengineering, and I thought, what is the root problem that's causing people to have delayed amputations? And in almost all cases, it was that some tissue was not regenerating, whether it's the bone or the nerve or the vessel. So I decided to focus on one of those, one of the most common ones, which is that the bone doesn't heal. It's called the non-union. I finished up my time in Iraq. I applied back to MIT to use the remaining years from the Hertz Foundation, and decided to devote myself to figuring out how do you develop a new medical implant that allows bone to regenerate in a way that you can't do now. So that that's what drove the decision of how to do this.
How did you, I don't know if pitch is the right word, but how did you bring this up to the military and ask them to get behind your efforts here?
It was a funny thing, actually. So when I got back from Iraq, there's a form in the Army called the 4187. And it's a one-page form, at least it was back then, that has the bottom half empty. And it's where you request follow-on assignments. So I basically wrote in that empty space, you will reassign me to MIT, to student detachment so I can go to MIT, and then you will reassign me to Natick Labs so that I can do utilization tour. And by the way, you're going to give me 3 years to do this. So when I sent this in, the branch manager at the time almost couldn't contain his laughter, because this type of request was unheard of. So I went to my commander at the time, Stephen Lanza, Colonel Stephen Lanza, who commanded I-Corps many years later. He said, give me 10 minutes. And 20 minutes later, I get a call from my branch saying your 4187 is approved. And that sent me on my way back to grad school. So it took just the intervention of one very convincing commander.
That's outstanding. Luis, let's pause right there. When we come back on Veterans Chronicles, we'll pick up the Luis Alvarez story and how he's working now to help heal his fellow warriors. If we've learned anything this year, it's the importance of soap and supporting small American businesses that keep our economy going. That's why we're introducing Hero Soap Company, a brand that pays homage to the values our country was founded on. With a U.S. Air Force veteran as an owner, Hero Soap Company understands the dedication and sacrifice each family makes to serve. Handmade in Phoenix, Arizona, each bar of Hero Soap is crafted with ingredients sourced from U.S. companies and is free of chemicals, dyes, fragrances, and parabens. Go to herosoapcompany.com to subscribe for a 20% saving and have soaps delivered every month. Order any number of soaps in your subscription, and Hero Soap Company will send a one-time matching number of soaps to the troops. Plus, a portion of every sale is donated to charities that help veterans and first responders, including Operation Finally Home. Use promo code Dana at checkout and save 10% on all non-subscription orders. Suds up with the Hero Soap Company. Promo code Dana. We are back on Veterans Chronicles. I'm Greg Corombos, honored to be joined today by U.S. Army veteran Luis Alvarez. We've talked about his time in Iraq, and as we left off, he was just talking about his efforts, his successful efforts, mind you, to have the military support his efforts to go figure out better ways to regenerate bones injured in combat. And so, Luis, what did you do once you got this blessing from the armed forces? How did you begin to turn this into an actual project, a research, and that sort of thing? Where do you start with something like that?
Sure. So, for me, it was an amazing opportunity because I could remain on active duty. I wanted to continue serving, but I also felt compelled to try to solve this problem in a meaningful way. And so this is where the Hertz Foundation came into play. The Hertz Foundation actually it has a long history. They provide, graduate fellowships in the hard sciences and engineering and mathematics. And it was actually started with the original mission was that anyone who receives this fellowship should be willing to give their talents in a time of national crisis. So it kind of grew out of the Manhattan Project and so on. And so that fellowship was what allowed me to go to MIT, and then at MIT specify what it is I wanted to work on. Normally, you go to a grad school and your advisor would tell you this is what you're going to do. But I had the fortune of working with Professor Linda Griffith, who was just a visionary in the field of regenerative medicine, and she gave me great guidance and inspiration. And it was in her lab that we were able to develop this technology.
And so did you have an idea already in mind? Was it a matter of trial and error? How did you go about figuring out exactly what would be the most effective at regeneration?
Sure. So, I had a base project which dealt with protein engineering. And this idea is something that I had kind of on the side. And so I said, Linda, I have a side idea for kind of a side project. And she was very flexible to letting me do that. Normally, some advisors will not let you do that. So what was a side project turned into a very successful effort to figure out how to attach proteins to implant materials like ceramics. And because of this, then we were able to establish the foundation for the technology.
So attaching proteins to ceramics and prosthetics, what's involved in that work?
Well, it's really a question of how do you engineer a protein so that instead of preferring to be in the liquid, it prefers to be stuck to a surface. And this involves, of course, some amount of biochemistry and some thermodynamics. But if you understand these principles, then you can change proteins so that they change their character. They go from being something that likes to be in solution to wanting to stick on a surface like a paint. And once you do that, then now you can think about making a protein that has a growth factor or something that promotes regeneration stuck to the surface of an implant. Now you've created an implant that is regenerative.
So where do you take that discovery from? Let's back up a little bit, actually. So how long did it take to get to the point that you wanted to be with that? How much trial and error or experimentation was required before you got to the next phase?
So I would say that most of that work I did in my second and third year at MIT. And then when I entered back into a regular Army assignment, I applied for a career development award through Fort Detrick. They have the congressionally directed medical research programs which fund military medical research. And through one of those grants, I was able to establish a small research effort and grow the technology a bit. And then, there were many years that went by where I was in other assignments where I couldn't really work on this. So there was some delay there. But in the end, when I retired from the Army, I formed a company and licensed the technology back to be able to develop this as a commercial product.
How many different steps or layers to this process are there? I know, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in just a little bit, that you've gone through animal trials with this. You're getting ready for human trials. But from when you're in the lab working with proteins and ceramics all the way down to actually getting human patients involved, I assume there's a lot of different layers. So how does that progression work?
Yeah, it is. It's a very long process, taking somewhere between 7 to 10 years for a usual protein therapeutic. For us, it has been no different. And so a lot of the work early on was to prove, does this really work? So we've done a lot of animal studies and developed an implant that is useful for surgeons to actually use in trauma injuries, for example. And that has taken many millions of dollars and years of effort to get to the point where now you can ask the FDA permission, can we try this in humans? So it's a lot of effort to establish the safety and efficacy in animals. And then you go to the FDA and say, I'd like to run trials and try this with humans who really may not have any alternatives to heal their injuries. So we're really excited to be able to start doing that in the next 18 months. What's
the working relationship with the FDA like? How often do you have to check back in with them at each step of the process, and how arduous is the approval?
Well, the FDA has been great actually to work with. You hear horror stories, but we have found that they are very forthcoming. They give you a lot of input. So we've taken the approach of talk with them early and often. And we've really benefited from that. So we thank the FDA for helping us understand what's required.
So we're almost caught up to where you are right now, but there's so much more to talk about here. Luis, let's pause one more time. We're with Luis Alvarez. He's the founder of Theradaptive. He's a U.S. Army veteran, and we're talking about ways to regenerate bone and tissue to help our wounded warriors and Americans dealing with all sorts of issues, perhaps down the road. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Veterans Chronicles. Happy to be joined today by Luis Alvarez. He's a U.S. Army veteran, West Point graduate, and he's now the founder of Theradaptive. And we've been talking about him pursuing this vision of making more regenerative bone and tissue material to help our wounded warriors, and its technology and developments that could certainly help Americans dealing with all sorts of injuries and other ailments as time goes on. So, Luis, we kind of talked about the path leading up to pretty much where you are right now. Let's talk a little bit about the animal trials, though. What were you looking for in those, and how close were the results to what you wanted to see?
Yeah, so we had prototypes for what we thought the implant should look like, and we were fortunate to be able to design that quickly. And so the next step is to test whether or not you can heal a bone defect in an animal. Let's say you lose 5 centimeters of bone in an accident. So that's a type of model we looked at in large animals. We did this study at the Cleveland Clinic, one of the top orthopedic hospitals in the country. And we found that we were able to completely regenerate a long defect, in fact, much better than the current standard of care. So we were very encouraged by this. We got a strong positive signal in that study and all the others. We've done about half a dozen other studies in other animals, all giving the same type of result where we're able to really induce really powerful bone formation in a way that hasn't been seen before.
What's the timetable once you start helping them with these proteins and so forth? How quickly does the bone start to regenerate and that sort of thing?
Yeah, so even as early as 4 weeks, in some studies we saw bone already starting to form. As you know, bone can take many months to heal. But in all the animal studies that we've done so far, even 12 weeks, we see complete healing in some cases. So it's quite a rapid process in some cases.
Yeah, from what I've seen, the goal is weeks, not months, for major breaks in legs and perhaps repairing cartilage that otherwise would not be able to be repaired at all. Do you have to choose certain animals that most closely line up with how human bones function, or is that pretty similar across the board?
That's a good question. There are differences. So yeah, we've to account for that, we've done studies in sheep, rats, goats, and rabbits. We've run out of animal species to test, and for the FDA's purposes, that checks all the boxes. So now we're very confident. If it works in those animals, it's been shown that it will work in humans.
Any side effects at all?
Well, that's the other interesting thing of this technology. There's another product on the market called BMP2 that can form bone as well, but there have been a lot of problems with keeping that protein in place. It doesn't stick to any surfaces, so you can have bone forming in other tissues like the muscle, and that can produce some really serious side effects. Because we stick to the device, we eliminate that side effect, and so we have a much lower, what we think will be a much lower side effect profile than the current best therapy on the market now.
So you have the green light now for the human trials?
Well, we do not yet. We're wrapping up our animal studies, and we are submitting very shortly to the FDA what's called an IDE, which is the request or permission to begin a phase 1 human study. And that'll be happening over the next 12 months.
Now, for anyone who's followed clinical trials, whether it's for vaccines or a disease of some sort, beginning human trials can still take a long time to get to where you want to be. But if you don't have any major setbacks, how soon could this theoretically be available?
Right. So as you are maybe familiar, many of the listeners, there are 3 stages, phase 1, 2, and 3. And to complete all stages, in this case, may take 4.5, maybe 5 years from today.
Wow, that's fantastic. And so you're focusing on bone, but what other areas of the body could potentially benefit from the technology that you've developed here?
Sure. So, I think the underlying platform technology that we have goes beyond bone, as you mentioned. Anytime that you have figured out how to stick a protein to a surface, that means now we can take any protein we want, any growth factor, and stick it onto virtually any implant. So that means you can now address cartilage, potentially skin, nerve, other soft tissues. So the company is also thinking about how to apply the technology to regenerate other tissues. It's not a one-shot, one goal type of therapy. It's a platform which can be extended to almost any tissue in the body. So it's a very exciting direction.
So it's not just skeletal and muscular. Is this something that could potentially be beneficial for combating disease, or does it have to be some sort of tissue involved in some way?
Well, that's a really good question. So, for example, let's say you wanted to do localized chemotherapy. In some cases in brain cancer, such as with glioblastoma, there are approaches where, you're able to place a wafer that has chemotherapeutic agent on the brain, and that will deliver that agent locally. So that approach has shown some success. You could adapt our technology to deliver therapeutics in the same way, because now you can have them stick onto a device, and as the device dissolves, it releases a chemotherapy agent. So we think there are also applications in the treatment of diseases like cancer or other diseases where you want local, persistent delivery of a therapeutic.
So this is a discovery that could really benefit millions and millions of people once the prototype is set here.
Yes, with resources, we think it can have a huge potential.
Well, you mentioned resources, and you've also co-founded the Defense Department's office looking into regeneration issues. Talk about the collaboration you've had with the Pentagon and the military, and as you've gone about this work.
Right. So my assignments have, as you said, taken me to program management of medical programs within the DoD when I was an Army major and lieutenant colonel. And part of that was managing the regenerative medicine portfolio. So that gave me a view of essentially a lot of efforts, and I learned a lot there. It was a kind of mini business school. You see what's done right and what isn't done right. And so when I left the service and retired, I had the company look into applying for grants. So the company applies for competitive grants and competes alongside everyone else. These are blinded or reviewed by external panels. So the company has done very well in being able to raise non-dilutive funding through the congressionally directed medical research program, and that has provided phenomenal support for the technology and for the therapy development.
What are you hearing from wounded warriors on this issue?
We get emails almost every day from people who are suffering from conditions like non-union, failure to heal, that are just life-changing, debilitating. And those emails really provide motivation for the team to develop these therapies because there is no alternative. There are no current treatments. So we're hearing from people a lot of hope and a lot of expectation about what's going to be happening.
Is there any sort of time window on how soon after an injury this sort of therapy would need to take place, or could it work 20 years after the injury?
Well, that remains an interesting question. There are times when a non-union can be treated years later, and that will eventually heal. So that points to the fact that the body does have some residual regenerative capacity. If this therapy can trigger that, then you might potentially be able to address injuries that have been around for years. But ideally, you'd want to treat something within a couple of weeks of when it occurred.
So, Luis, you mentioned that obviously this is research that takes years and years and years. That means lots and lots of funding. Are you asking for folks to help out? Is the partnership with the military and others providing those resources? You mentioned the private money you've also gotten. So are you good on resources, or can folks help out if they'd like to?
Well, the company, as you mentioned, is doing quite a bit and being a good steward of these grant funds from the DoD, from the congressionally directed medical research program, and is in the process now of raising additional funding through venture capital. The company will require more resources as it gets into phase 2 and 3. Those are very expensive trials. So there will be future capital raising activities in the years to come. Absolutely.
You mentioned the more involved phase 2 and phase 3 trials. What's on the FDA checklist to move you along in that process? What do you have to prove to them? Yes.
So the FDA is worried first and foremost about safety. So do we have a serious adverse events of any kind, any unexpected effects? And then they're worried in phase 2 and 3, especially about efficacy in addition to safety. So are we really better statistically, in a very rigorous way? Are we better or equivalent to the very best treatment there is now? Because even if you're just as good as the best treatment, but you're also safer, that's progress. So those are the two things they're worried about, and they're always checking various metrics to make sure you're meeting both requirements.
You mentioned some kind of competitors is the right word, but you mentioned there's others out there, but they haven't been able to make the protein stick. Are there others kind of pursuing the same line that you are, or are you really the pioneer in this field?
We look around and we're surprised. There aren't that many people that we know of or other groups that are modifying proteins directly to make them change their behavior so that you can turn them into therapeutics the way we are. Most of the large orthopedic companies are actually experts in hardware, but not in protein therapeutics. So we've had discussions with Medtronic and Johnson & Johnson and Stryker, the big names. But I think the way they interpret the business opportunity is from the perspective of stainless steel and inert implants, and not so much from a biologic, because it is different than their business model. So while we think there's interest, we think that there's perhaps maybe misunderstanding or misconceptions about the potential of the technology in some cases.
People do like to stick with what they know until they can have it proven to them that going this way is the better way. There's just a couple of minutes left in our conversation, Luis. This is absolutely fascinating. What are you most proud of? I'm going to ask this in two phases, but what are you most proud of, first of all, from your time in uniform?
I'm most proud of being able to have contributed in the various units that I've been in a meaningful way. I had a commander early on that said, if you forget everything else, just remember, try to leave things better than how you found them. And I'd like to think that I did that at each unit, and having the opportunity to do that and to serve has been really something that I remember fondly, and I miss not being in the service anymore. But it's just being able to devote my life to service is what I'm most proud of.
What's it going to mean to you? I'm sure you've thought about this. The day that this advancement that you've been working on now for years and will for years to come actually changes and improves specific lives.
Well, that's it's kind of the holy grail. The full actualization of your ideas is probably the most satisfying thing in life, right? If you can conceive of something and it takes you great effort and many years and a lot of blood, sweat, and tears to make happen, and it happens, then you've accomplished something. You've contributed something to mankind. So for me, it would be a successful thing. I want to retire after that. My wife wouldn't let me, but I would be very happy.
If there are veterans watching or listening to this and thinking, I want to be part of the process, I don't just want to be receiving this at the end of the line, I want to be part of these trials. Is there a way to sign up for that or get in contact with you? How does that work?
Right, so we haven't kicked off trials yet, but in the future, once we establish the trials, they'll be publicly registered on clinicaltrials.gov, as you may know. And at that point, there would be some enrollment process. If people wanted to participate, they can contact their physicians at that point.
Any last words that you'd like to share with folks about what you're doing, what you hope to achieve, and the lives you hope to change?
Always hope for a brighter future and see what it is you can do to bring that about.
Well, that was very succinct and also very good. Finally, Luis, if folks want to keep up with what you're doing, you mentioned the clinical trials website, any other websites or email lists that folks can sign up for or log on to keep up with what you're doing?
Well, the company website is theradaptive.com, and there's a news section there that people can read, and there's also a contact section if people want to share any ideas.
Fantastic. Luis, it's been an amazing conversation, not only for your service in Iraq, but your vision for this in the first place, and then putting in all the work to get it closer and closer to becoming a reality. It is truly amazing. So thank you for the work you're doing. Thank you for your service to our country, your ongoing service to those who have served. And we really appreciate your time with us today. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Absolutely. Luis Alvarez is a veteran of the U.S. Army. He's a West Point graduate. He served in Iraq. He's now the founder of Theradaptive as they're getting closer and closer to providing regenerative materials to help wounded warriors and others regrow bone, and eventually tissue and other parts of the body. I'm Greg Corumbus. This is Veterans Chronicles.